Okay, if I could ask you all to take your seats, please. We're going to have our second keynote address now, and it is really a great privilege and pleasure to welcome Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. Dr. Carhart-Harris received his PhD in psychopharmacology from the University of Bristol, and then he moved over to Imperial College London. And as I'm sure you all know, he has really conducted foundational work. He's been at the vanguard of the renaissance of interest in psychedelic neuroscience and psychedelic therapy. He's worked across the translational spectrum from foundational theory to fundamental science to clinical trials. And again, contributing both to the neuroscientific aspect and the therapeutic aspect of psychedelics. Fortunately for us in the United States, he's recently moved to San Francisco. He is the Ralph Metzner Professor of Neurology, Psychiatry, and Behavioral Sciences, and the Director of the Psychedelics Division at UCSF. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris.
Thank you, George, and thank you, everyone. Do you know, I think it was 3 years ago I came here last. Would it be 3? It's not going to be 2. And I was with my wife, and we attended a morning meditation. And after that, you know, we sort of smiled at each other and said, you know, we quite like it. You know? Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Well, maybe we should move to the US. And it wasn't Tucson, but it wasn't so far away. And I'm so pleased that Abby and Stuart and George made it easy for us to come in person, and my family have very much enjoyed what's been a holiday as well as a bit of work right now. So my job right now is to try and keep you engaged for an hour plus, which is a challenge, but I'll do my absolute best. It does help that I enjoy my topic. Yeah, of course. And so hopefully you can come along on that flow. And it is intrinsically fascinating, I think, psychedelics. And I focus on classic psychedelics. One of the reasons being that we can sharpen our definition a little bit when we look at the classics. These are all compounds that work on a particular aspect of the serotonin system, and I believe we know this with quite a high degree of confidence from converging lines of evidence. We can look at where those serotonin receptors are in the living human brain through this PET imaging work. Most recent PET imaging work is using agonist ligands that will label the receptor in its functionally available state. So we're seeing the functionally available 2A receptors that will be hit by an agonist coming in. And we can see where they're distributed in the living human brain. We can see that they're very much cortical receptors, very high expression throughout the cortex there, and not entirely homogeneously so. So relatively less expression in the motor cortex, very high expression, high up the hierarchy in the most recent cortex that has expanded most in our species, so-called transmodal association cortex. And as we go on, we'll realize that that is likely very important to the action of these compounds. So we know that the 2A receptor is really critical to the action of classic psychedelics for a few reasons. And one of the reasons was discovered in the mid-1980s, which was the strong positive correlation between the affinity of a range of different classic psychedelics for the 2A receptor and these drugs' potency. So for example, LSD, very high affinity for 2A and very potent. I wonder if I move away from the mic, you'll still be able to hear me well enough. Good, I got my mic on here. Whereas mescaline, much lower, a couple of orders of magnitude less binding potential for the 2A receptor, much less sticky if you want for that particular receptor. Still an agonist, and still 2A agonism is key to the action of of mescaline, but much lower affinity, therefore much less potency. So, for example, Aldous Huxley, in his famous mescaline experience that he wrote about in The Doors of Perception, took 400 milligrams, so close to half a gram of mescaline, whereas the psychoactive dose of LSD is in the microgram range. So you need 1,000 mics to get a mig, right? So a couple of orders of magnitude less potent is mescaline to LSD. More compelling evidence for the importance of the 2A receptor really came with Franz Vollenweider's work in the mid to late 1990s, where he would give a relatively, somewhat selective serotonin 2A receptor blocker before giving, in this case, psilocybin was the first work. And the signature psychological effects of the psilocybin were significantly attenuated, if not abolished, by giving that blocker of the 2A receptor before giving the agonist. And that work has since been replicated with different psychedelics, Katrin Preller with LSD, Jordi Rieber and others with ayahuasca. So it does seem to be critically important, and similar work can be done outside of the human animal, in non-human animals, with signature behavioral effects of psychedelics being blocked by 2A blockers. So converging evidence there. We also now have some more neat PET work from the Copenhagen group, Gita Knudsen and others, looking at a range of different doses of psilocybin given to brains when they're being labeled with these 2A agonist hot ligands. So that's where we're picking up the signal from where the 2A receptors are. Then we give what we call the cold ligand, psilocybin, bigger doses of it. It's going to displace the hot ligand, and we'll be able to look at the percentage occupancy of available serotonin 2A receptors. And in a sense, this is a sort of validity check, albeit a very sophisticated and expensive one, but needed to be done. And you see that the higher the displacement of that hot ligand by bigger doses of psilocybin correlates with stronger subjective intensity produced by those dosages of psilocybin. And what was useful is that now we know what kind of percentage occupancy is required to get a certain experience of a certain intensity. And it transpires at around about the 60% plus threshold of occupancy, which translates into dosages of psilocybin around about 20 milligrams, so close to therapeutic doses that are being used in most of the trials at the moment. That's producing quite substantial subjective effects. In the past, I've commented, and I'm going to do it again, on this apparent nonlinearity, which I think is intriguing. It's way too early to make assumptions with such small data about a nonlinear relationship between 2A occupancy and subjective intensity, but it's hinted at, and I think that's intriguing because it may well, sort of fit intuition that over a certain dosage, there's an inflection of sorts. The experience becomes something extra, if you want, and it's that dose range that we're trying to, that level of intensity that we're trying to achieve in psychedelic therapy. It seems the dose does need to be high enough, if you want, in psychedelic therapy. Let me emphasize that. Now, it's also worth mentioning, especially when you have an hour to talk, about the etymology of the term psychedelic itself, coined by Humphrey Osmond, apparently in a talk at a meeting, New York Academy of Sciences event in 1956. And it also, the deriving of this term occurred through dialogue between Humphrey Osmond, British psychiatrist working in Canada at the time, a dialogue between him and Aldous Huxley. Huxley had heard of this British psychiatrist doing interesting work, working with psychoactive compounds like mescaline, and so he reached out, and we know that it was Humphrey Osmond that actually supplied the mescaline that Aldous Huxley would go on to take and then write about in The Doors of Perception. But these two individuals, the intellectuals that they were, felt that the current terms available for referring to this class of compounds essentially weren't good enough. They weren't really capturing what they felt was the essence, the essential component, if you want, of the property of these compounds. What do they do to the mind? What do they do to the psyche? So Huxley had a stab at came up with phanrethyme. I think it was something along the lines of releasing the spirit. Someone could correct me on that afterwards. But it was Osman's term psychedelic, combining psyche and another Greek term, delos, referring to manifest, that would win out. And as Osmond commented at the time, he said it's euphonious, the term. It sounds nice. And so, in my view, not only is it a good term, it captures something that is essential about these compounds, but it does sound nice. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's stuck. I think it's the only one. But psyche, which the most literal translation of psyche, as a Greek speaker would tell you, is soul. It's not mind, it's soul. So it's quite a soulful term as well. Psyche, revealing to make the soul manifest. And I'm glad it stuck. Others have challenged it. But I actually think it's the most, dare I say, secular and useful and accurate, I actually think. So psychedelic is what we have. So that covered the essential pharmacology of classic psychedelics, that their action begins at a certain serotonin receptor. I've shown you where it is, high up in the hierarchy of brain evolution and organization. It couldn't be higher in a sense. It's in the most recent cortex. This is where the action begins. This is the starting point, if you want. Given that we know that, despite all the abstraction and life-changing quality of a psychedelic experience, to know with a high degree of precision and confidence that it begins at a particular serotonin receptor, I think is essentially important and very grounding, scientifically grounding. And so then, for me, it draws my mind into asking questions like, what is it about this receptor, Is there something, particularly special, say, about this serotonin 2A receptor that's stimulating it can produce such profound altered states of consciousness? So like others, I've gone down that rabbit hole, and I point out a few different properties, if you want, of 2A stimulation. One umbrella construct that captures people's liking often is plasticity. If you look that up in the dictionary definition of plasticity is the ability to be shaped or molded. I think sometimes people see that term and they sort of misinterpret it as meaning simple change. Plasticity equals change or even growth. Those things are related. Look it up in the dictionary, you'll find it there. It is the ability to be shaped or molded. So in a sense, a synonym for plasticity would be malleability. And so there are different flavors of plasticity that we could look at. We could, as many people do, and it gets a lot of attention, look at neuroplasticity and anatomical markers. And I think this is probably, sort of really kicked off an emphasis on plasticity, is these quite recent evidences of, for example, increases in synaptogenesis with the administration of a range of different psychedelics. You can see that schematic on the right. First paper published of real note, published in Cell a few years ago now by David Olson and colleagues. But we could rewind a little bit in history to notice another important property, which is that a marker of plasticity, neuroplasticity, in this case brain-derived neurotrophic factor, yes, it's increased in this case rodent brain, but it's increased somewhat selectively, it seems, in cortex. Remember where those 2A receptors are especially heavily expressed in cortex. And actually, if we look at a subcortical structure like the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, there's a decrease, significant decrease in BDNF expression in the subcortex there. So I think that's a useful potential principle that can sharpen our understanding of the action of psychedelics, that these increases in neuroplasticity seem to be especially marked and perhaps especially reliable in cortex where the 2A receptors are housed. There's a variety there's a wealth of evidence to link serotonin to brain development, but also the 2A receptor specifically. I can't go into all of it, but I'll highlight one, and I've done that in yellow here. A really exciting study and finding that a student of ours at Imperial pulled out and brought to our attention, looking in embryonic brain in a few different species, and looking at the proliferation of basal progenitor cells. So the authors of this paper, based in Max Planck, had done a lot of work on brain evolution and early brain development. And so they knew that this proliferation of these particular pre-neurons, if you want, neural stem cells, if you want, was critical to cortical expansion. And what they discovered in this paper was that 2A stimulation specifically seemed to be exciting this process of the proliferation of basal progenitor cells. And they also showed across species that this effect was especially marked in the human species. Less so, I think it was ferret embryonic brain, and then minimal, if nothing, in rodent brain, I think mouse brain. So the authors, in the abstract of that paper, which was published in Neuron, so a highly prestigious journal, made the extrapolation there in the abstract that perhaps serotonin 2A receptor signaling has played a role in cortical expansion, has played a role in brain evolution of the human brain. So I think that's fascinating, and for some of you, you might be thinking, stoned ape hypothesis. I wonder if it's psychedelics being ingested and stimulating cortical expansion. I would say, less haste. Serotonin, that could have done it, and perhaps there are conditions under which the body releases or upregulates serotonin functioning and 2A signaling in a way that could drive cortical expansion. So Occam's razor would probably say, let's think about the endogenous ligand that we know is there. It's an intriguing hypothesis that maybe there are endogenous psychedelics. Yes, I know about the rodent work with DMT release. There's a lot that's released during dying. But yes, there are marked spikes in DMT release and endogenous psychedelic during the dying process. Serotonin as well, so let's remember that. So I certainly wouldn't want to rule out the possibility of endogenous psychedelic release, but probably the simplest inference would be that maybe there's something about the endogenous ligand hitting that receptor that could drive cortical expansion. Learning, there's a lot of evidence to link 2A receptor signaling with learning, low-level learning. And if you dive into the literature, I'll just pause for a moment and say that the synaptogenesis work also now translates in vivo, so living animals, with extended increases in synaptogenesis out over 1 month after a single administration of psilocybin here, so enduring increases in neuroplasticity with even a single administration of drug. That's pretty amazing, but it's also interesting in the context of the human therapeutic work, where the improvements in symptom severity that are being seen in symptom domains like depression, symptom clusters if you want, are being seen in this enduring way. So potentially, a mechanistic mapping there with this in vivo rodent work. So where was I going? I was going here, which was to talk about learning and learning rate. And really, I think when we're thinking about learning, it would be easy to misinterpret a rule between 2A signaling or oversimplify a rule between 2A signaling and learning. It's easy to imagine scenarios, and these have been shown in literature, of learning being impaired with too high a dose of a psychedelic, or the learning itself being too complex to really be enhanced in any way by a psychedelic that could easily cause a generalized deficit confound, where in a sense you can't do the task because you're generally impaired. So that's an important qualifier when we look at learning, because the types of learning that seem to be enhanced with 2A signaling are low-level learning, implicit learning. Here, this study in rabbits looking at aversive learning with air puffs. And it was the learning rate that was accelerated with 2A agonism, in this case LSD, and also learning rate slowed down with administration of a 2A blocking agent, ritanserin. Now we can move up a level, in a sense, to another behavioral phenomenon, cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift one's behavior, say when a rule changes. The evidence there for any acute enhancement of cognitive flexibility is quite mixed. If anything, it's more weighty in the direction of cognitive inflexibility under drug. I wonder if that's a sort of related to that generalized deficit confound and the inability to perform certain functions when impaired by too high a dose of a psychedelic. But if you look post-acutely, and we've seen this now in a healthy volunteer study where we look 1 month post-exposure to 25 milligrams of psilocybin, I'm citing other studies here as well that have shown this, Hopkins have shown this, you'll find increases in cognitive flexibility. So it's one of those scenarios where something that you'll see acutely under drug, you're actually seeing the inverse if you look post-acutely. So an enhancement of the ability to set shift or have reversal learning, the ability to have cognitive flexibility. After drug, drug's washed out of body and flexibility is enhanced, but under drug, that rule won't hold up necessarily. Now we could look at psychological flexibility, moving up a level, again in terms of abstraction. This is a construct that's popularized around a certain style of psychotherapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm smiling because that's my son at the back there. And nice to hear him. Psychological flexibility refers to the ability to sit with difficult feeling states, difficult emotions, challenging emotions, sit with them in a sort of accepting way rather than seeking avoidant defense mechanisms that can easily, develop into rigid, inflexible ways of thinking and or behaving, which we'll hear in a moment. I'm going to suggest could be the essential thing, if you want, of psychopathology, the principal component. Psychological flexibility, a couple of studies at least now. I think I could probably expand my references there. There's more than 2 showing increases in psychological flexibility after psychedelic therapy, and actually after psychedelic exposure itself. Now, environmental sensitivity, susceptibility to one's environment. And for those of you familiar with the literature, you might think of literature around, highly susceptible individuals, the highly sensitive person, some genetic work around that. This is kind of in that, well, it is in that ballpark, and a lot of that literature has looked at the serotonin system in particular. I think that's very relevant literature to what I'm highlighting here as a property of psychedelics. What I've said elsewhere is their essential context, or rather, the quality of a psychedelic experience is essentially context dependent, essentially dependent on the environmental, defined in an extended sense because environment is inside as well as outside, highly dependent on environmental conditions. So these 2 citations are just to a couple of demonstrations of this principle, one with a hypnotic suggestibility paradigm, which was more effective, if you want, under LSD in this case, and another study looking at the emotional impact of music listening. They're very simple studies, very simple measures, but demonstrating a principle. There's likely much more than this in the literature. Again, perhaps a case for me to review what I'm citing here and expand it. But in a sense, just a moment of reflection that this isn't demonstrated more. One of the reasons it isn't is that it's very challenging to do in human beings, because often when we're doing the psychedelic therapy work, we're trying to provide a kind of ideal setting, an ideal context, and anything less than that can feel ethically challenging. However, I still think that there really is a compelling scientific argument to be made for doing more research in this domain to demonstrate or really test and then demonstrate our assumptions that the psychedelic experience and indeed the psychedelic therapeutic effect is essentially context dependent. And that will require some, I would say quite brave studies to be done, but I think it can be done. I think you can have a condition that covers essential safety and then another contextual condition that is enriched. It's really trying to, provide an especially nice setting or context with the prediction that there will be a synergy between drug and that enriched context that will be significantly greater than any of the other permutations. So placebo, unenriched, enriched, or drug, unenriched, basic safety. That kind of work needs to be done, because if it isn't done, then people could easily misunderstand psychedelics, I think, and their medicinal potential, and make inferential errors such as drug alone is sufficient. And I think if people go down that track and were to really hammer that track, some major mistakes could be made. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. I also, somewhat related, these points just at the bottom here, speaking to this question of, is it all about serotonin 2A receptor signaling? There's a paper published in PNAS showing that in rodent models, some behavioral markers of antidepressant effects can be seen with psychedelics that appeared not to be dependent on 2A signaling. There's a couple of other studies published in, and I'm citing them in 50 and 51 there in Nature and Science, suggesting that antidepressant behaviors in rodents can be seen without rodent behaviors that relate to, in a translational way, relate to psychedelic effects. Therefore, can you have antidepressant drugs that involve some kind of 2A agonism but don't produce psychedelic effects? I mean, those studies, those findings are published in the most prestigious scientific journals, and I'm skeptical. And the reason being is that it rests on this assumption that those markers are going to translate, and time will tell whether they do. And if they do, I would also want to question whether they really have that much to do with psychedelic therapy, or perhaps these scientists have discovered other types of chronic medication strategies, giving drug regularly, as has been done for decades now. And I think it's healthy to ask the question, do we want more of that? Well, let's see. It's quite a simplistic model of how to treat mental health, in my view. Drug alone, staying drugged daily for long periods, and that's going to right you, that's going to remediate your ills. Let's see. But, that work is getting certainly high impact publications. Wouldn't it be fascinating, comment to self in a way, to be wrong on this? And actually, there are some major breakthroughs there through the pharmacology of 2A agonist compounds or other mechanisms that could be therapeutic in a breakthrough way. Also refer to some MDMA work suggesting that action outside of the 2A receptor may be playing a role in some of the therapeutic effects of that compound, which I wouldn't consider to be a psychedelic if we have a precise definition. If we loosen our precision, we could call it psychedelic-like. I think it is, and it's certainly serotonergic. So some interesting evidence that maybe some of its pro-social effects in an animal model, a rodent model, could be mediated through another serotonin receptor, serotonin 4 receptor in particular. Potential links to oxytocin mechanisms as well there. So that was a lot of depth on the pharmacology. I don't really apologize for it because, again, I think it's important to hover there for a while on the 2A receptor, given the converging evidence that it seems to be so essentially important to the action of classic psychedelics. And I addressed its function, some of the things that are associated with upregulating 2A signaling, but I think it also leads on to another question that links to function, which is, what is its evolutionary function? Under what environmental conditions could you modulate 2A functioning? And there, diving into the literature, I'd been noticing for a while that there was an association with stress, and then working with a US student, an undergrad actually at the time, Ari Brower. He helped me compile the evidence and dive into the evidence around stress and the 2A receptor. And what emerged from that process, and also the reviews of the initial work, was that the relationship seems to be somewhat nuanced. So chronic stress in particular appears to sensitize the 2A receptor, both increase its availability to signaling and also increase its sensitivity to signaling if we look at readout of signaling. And that's what I'm showing here, just 3 examples, but there are deeper references there as well. One with hypoxia. Some of you might be thinking, breath work, and yes, indeed, maybe breath work engages the serotonin 2A receptor in an interesting way that could explain some of the overlaps in the phenomenology between, for example, holotropic breath work and psychedelics. So upregulating the availability of the 2A receptor, markedly so in this study, but also other studies looking at stress paradigms, chronic stress paradigms, increasing readouts of 2A signaling. This one on the furthest right there, looking at a pretty horrible combination of maternal separation and chronic immobilization stress, and a very marked increase in sensitivity of a marker of 2A signaling. So if that's the background, if you want, of sensitizing the 2A system, it's adversity, it's chronic, persistent adversity, the driver of evolutionary change, if you want, or at least one of the 2 major drivers. And the other one being the other condition here to activate endogenously, if you want, or at least without a drug, 2A receptor signaling is with acute stress overlaid. So what's the most reliable way to release serotonin in the brain, short of giving a drug? It seems to be punishment paradigms. Here I show a study that looks at tail pinch, handling, and swim stress with large spikes in serotonin release in those stressful conditions. So you're overlaying a background of chronic adversity with acute stress. You'll engage this system that psychedelic drugs hijack, but you're doing it in a sense in an environmental, sort of endogenous way. And I think this tells us something potentially about the evolution of this system that psychedelics hijack, that it may have evolved as a stress response system. So psychedelics hijack a stress response system is what I'm proposing here. And why would that confer any evolutionary advantage? Well, if it increases the ability to be shaped or molded, it could increase our ability to change, to be adaptable under these conditions of adversity, where the conditions are so hard, so enduringly hard, that something has to give. Transformation, major, deep transformation is needed. And I think that's the system that psychedelics hijack. Just a little reference at the end there to say it's easy to see stress as all bad in a similar way that we could be simplistic about plasticity and see that as all good. but I just want to cite one example here at least of acute stress increasing brain plasticity in the cortex. This particular study didn't look at the mechanisms of that effect, but it's possible it was 2A mediated. So I think that's enough on the potential evolution of this system that psychedelics hijack, but it provides the background, in a sense, the low-level basic science background for introducing a somewhat abstract construct, as we did, Ari Brauer and I, in this paper entitled The Pivotal Mental States, which are defined as transient hyperplastic states, states of instability in a sense, in which the system, the agent, is especially sensitive to their contextual conditions. If that instability and that enhanced plasticity occurs under conditions of ongoing adversity, a highly aversive or adverse, I often get those mixed up, context, then it's easy to intuit that the agent would gravitate away from health, highly sensitive, and conditions are bad, and individual is moving towards pathology, whatever that might be. It could be a PTSD, it could be a psychosis, it could be a depression, but that plasticity in and of itself isn't a healing or a healthy phenomenon. It's just the ability to be shaped or molded. Now, imagine a context where you take someone with an existing pathology and you induce that transient state of instability and hyperplasticity, and you enrich the contextual conditions in a wonderfully supportive, empathetic way. That's psychedelic therapy, and that's the treatment model that is being looked at the moment. And I highlight here some take-home messages from this work, because it's too rich now, really, to go into all the details. But there are some important principles that are emerging from the psychedelic therapy literature. Really only began in 2006 in terms of the modern human clinical research with psychedelics. Francesco Moreno at San Diego, looking at OCD. But the take-home points to emphasize are positive contextual manipulation, a rapid action. Here I just show our first study, first of two in depression, in this case treatment-resistant depression. So you can see those rapid drops in depressive symptom severity. And apparently enduring therapeutic action, somewhat remarkably so in the context of, say, pharmacotherapy, a single dose of a drug, well washed out of the body, and yet symptom severity is significantly dropped with often quite large effect sizes out at 3 months, 6 months plus. What's happening there? It's very hard for sort of basic pharmacologists to wrap their head around. Drugs well out of body, so it's not a drug effect. So what is the change? Anyway, the change is being observed. The other one is this apparent transdiagnostic action that a number of different symptom clusters, call them diagnoses if you want, appear to be treatable, show signal with psychedelic therapy. And different studies being cited here do know that you could probably times this by 3 or 4 at least. In terms of current studies, a lot being looked at. And so time will tell whether some of this early enthusiasm that you've all been seeing is excessive optimism, or whether there's something really there. Yes. And the other fourth take-home message, which I only put in this morning, is that, again, it comes back to seeing psychedelic therapy as a combination treatment. It's not just drug, in the same way that it's not just all about the therapy. Drug's certainly doing something, and it deserves to be understood. So I call it a process model, as others do. It's just a sort of logical way to think about the action of the therapy. And I show a couple of examples of these path models that we've been testing really through my collaborations with colleagues at Imperial. Here's just one looking at emotional breakthrough, a lot of emphasis has been placed on mystical type experiences. I think there's clearly something there in terms of the evidence, but some of our more recent work is suggesting that actually emotional breakthrough is, if anything, a stronger predictor or mediator of therapeutic outcomes. In this particular study, where we validated a new scale for looking at psychological insight, here's some examples of items from that scale. I've had important new insights about how past events have influenced my current mental health and behavior. So mediated in a path model through psychological insight is predicting well-being. This sample was quite large. It was naturalistic, prospective, before and after, observational data, close to 300 people. But there is a quest, I think, in the field to try, in a sense, to find a simple algorithm that could highlight the key processes involved in therapeutic change with psychedelic therapy. Insight is an especially interesting one because it's talking about some kind of epistemic change, some new knowing, if you want. And perhaps that new knowing is why when drug is so well washed out of the body, people remain changed. They know something now, and it's hard to forget. You can forget in a way, but it's easy to be reminded. And maybe greater efforts could be made to help with that reminding, marrying psychedelic therapy with practice, for example. Spiritual practice would be one example. Another path model that we've looked at, published recently, looked at Therapeutic Alliance, and what we found actually in this study was that it was a single item, it was a visual analog scale, 0 to 100, that people rated on the morning of their dosing session. In this particular trial, it was our more recent trial, 2 doses of psilocybin, 3 weeks apart, and on the morning of each session, we asked this question. You rate 0 to 100. Gosh, what are the anchors? Not at all to extremely, I think. I have a good relationship with the main person or people who look after me during the upcoming experience. And we found that this was a significant mediator of therapeutic outcomes, feeding into emotional breakthrough. So how trusting you are of your guides, if you want, your therapists on the morning of the session, in the minutes ideally prior to administration, is going to be significantly predictive of an emotional breakthrough experience. As I've told you a moment ago, in itself seems to be a key mediator of therapeutic effects. So it required some time, I think, to mention that. Again, that's something I put in this morning because I think it would be easy to misinterpret, again, the action of psychedelic therapy and gloss over that. Now, that transdiagnostic possibility that psychedelic therapy could treat a lot could mean one of two things, probably others as well. One would be that we're getting carried away and seeing this as some kind of miracle cure and a cure-all, or there's something to it. And maybe psychedelic therapy does target a common space, maybe a principal component of psychopathology. I just want to entertain that thought for a moment and suggest that a candidate for a principal component of psychopathology, borrowing a term, a phenomenon, a construct from evolutionary science, could be canalization, in a sense the inverse of plasticity, the inverse of the ability to be shaped or molded. Instead, the way a particular phenotype could be stamped in, say stamped into the genome, resistant to change, inflexible thinking and or behavior. And you can see that in a range of different symptom clusters, whether it's the negative cognitive bias in depression, habits of mind and or behavior in OCD, habitual ways of looking at oneself and one's body and eating and image disorders, and habits and controlling one's diet so carefully, addictions, broad range of addictions fitting this, habits, specific anxieties, and the inflexibility around those, phobias, for example, and also functional neurological disorders, which also perhaps relate to how you relate to your physical symptom. And so if this is a common space defined by inflexibility, and I'm not really the first to suggest this, you can find relevant themes in, say, acceptance and commitment therapy, around psychological avoidance versus acceptance, that inflexibility. But if the solution is to increase plasticity, increase the ability to be shaped or molded, and you do that in a way that's twinned with therapy, then that's what I'm proposing is what psychedelic therapy is doing. It's harnessing a window of opportunity for potential change and then trying to allow that change to move in a healthy direction away from pathology. Okay, so that was in a sense the background. And now we'll have a look at the brain and how it changes under psychedelics. I say leave the trenches, not entirely in just a poetic way, but because a collaborator of ours, Andrea Lupi at Cambridge, looked at how brain function relates to brain structure under different states of consciousness. Anesthetics, for example, move the brain function closer to structure, whereas psychedelics allow it to drift away or depart from anatomy. So when I say leaving the trenches, it's not entirely poetic. And so when we look in the brain with fMRI, look at how the brain regions are communicating with each other and brain systems, we're seeing a particular principle emerge quite reliably, and it's that the communication appears to increase between systems under drug. We saw it here classically with psilocybin, much more crosstalk between systems. We've seen it with LSD, in this case seeding V1, identified with retinotopic mapping, and then asking where in the brain is activity synchronous in its spontaneous fluctuations across time with V1. Ordinarily, it's other regions of the visual system, doing vision if you want. And under drug, under LSD, it's much more of the brain is now coupling to the spontaneous activity of V1. This effect correlated with complex visual imagery. People had their eyes closed, so it was very much imagery. The vividness of that correlating with this expansion in visual cortex communication. And with DMT now as well, looking at global functional connectivity and seeing increases in transmodal cortex. You will see in a moment how this pattern maps to a familiar pattern that you can see looking at a range of different properties of brain organization. It relates to a principal component, the principal component of the organization of functional connectivity in the human brain, and this pattern is increasing under DMT, and we found the same with LSD and psilocybin. And if you dive into that a little bit, looking at the dynamics of functional connectivity across a scanning period, as we've done here, you could also do it with another technique, hidden Markov modeling. Some collaborators looking at that right now on our data. You can notice a couple of things, and one is that high-level networks, that's not going to work for you. High-level networks, you can see the red default mode network there. You can see the orange two frontoparietal networks. The time in which the brain visits these states, these networks are states in a sense, and resides there is diminished significantly so under psychedelic. Here with DMT, we've seen the same with psilocybin and LSD. And a other state that is globally coherent is visited more frequently under drug. So this increase in global functional connectivity occurs more often than ordinarily you would see in the brain, say under placebo or under no drug at all. So there's a diminishment of these networks that are particularly high level. And you may remember we'll go there in a moment, that it's where the 2A receptors are most densely expressed. We can also look at other metrics, and I think it's useful to have a range of different metrics, sort of looking at the same phenomena from different angles. We look at the hierarchical organization of functional activity in the brain, looking at the principal component and how that is compressed or collapsed under psychedelics. Here you can see the gradient, that principal gradient or dimension with the sharp demarcation of the yellow and the blue, the top left corner there, and how that smudges together, or shmush, I've heard in the US. There's a collapse of the hierarchy under drug, and this seems to relate to subjective effects and to be true across different psychedelics. Collapse in hierarchy. Selene, who's graced this conference in the past. In fact, I met Selene for the first time here. It took me a little while to appreciate her approach, and now it's one of my favorites. I think it's so intriguing what it could tell us about consciousness and psychedelics. And here, this is work in review. Andrea Lupi will be first author, but it's looking at a variety of states of consciousness and how psychedelics will increase the expression of high-frequency harmonics or patterns, spatial patterns in the brain, diminish the lower frequency ones, whereas the opposite is the case with compounds or states in which consciousness is reduced. And yes, that kind of relates to the entropic brain hypothesis. It's been a while since I've had a slide on this, but maybe it's time and the right place as well. I think on reflection, the hypothesis is proving, I think, quite useful. It's been challenged for being too simple, that one dimension to look at conscious states is way too simple, and I hear that, of course. We can look at other dimensions and have a fuller model, but is there a principal component? And is it useful to find principal components when they potentially explain a lot of variance? And I stand by this proposal that information, if you want, entropy, uncertainty, information content is increased under psychedelics and more clearly relates to the richness of conscious experience. And if challenged on that, and I should have been, what's meant by richness? And I've just reflected on this quite a bit recently and have suggested something for the first time here, that it could be defined as the depth of content of phenomenal experience. And one reason why I think I need to say more about what do I mean by richness is that there's an interesting, as yet to my knowledge, untested thing here, and it's 5-methoxy-DMT, and it's this question: what's it going to do to brain entropy? Yes, I'm treating signal diversity, signal complexity as essentially synonymous with that, and the hypothesis that I would go with, we're in the hypothesis game here, is that it's going to increase brain complexity. A previous version of this schematic, which I think you saw shown earlier today, had unconsciousness in the upper space there. I tried to find the original PowerPoint to change the actual schematic because I think it needs updating. But really the point, so I just stuck a red triangle in there instead. But the point I want to make is that upper space is one of a special intrigue, And 5-MeO, I imagine, I'm going to hypothesize, is in a sense more of the same, but just especially marked increase in signal complexity. If there's something lost of consciousness, that's why I had to get rid of unconsciousness in the top part, it's the ability to report it after the event, potentially. So is that report consciousness? I don't know. But phenomenal consciousness, I think it's rare for people to come back from an experience and say that it was in any way a blackout. They might call it a whiteout. but they still say that they were online. And so I think that's intriguing. So I had to take unconsciousness away. Depends, of course, how you define consciousness. But if we are thinking of content of consciousness, and if signal complexity, signal entropy is tracking that, then I'd predict it goes up with 5-MeO as well. It does very markedly with NN-DMT. Then if we're thinking about the richness of, or richness, if we think about the depth of content, richness is referring to depth of content, I think people would say that it was an experience, and I only hear this secondhand, of everythingness, you know. And so I think that could fit. How that relates to criticality in the brain, which, as some of you will know, is in the entropic brain hypothesis, that psychedelics are tuning the brain closer to criticality, is a matter of serious intrigue, because, you know, is there an overshoot into supercriticality? Is something lost because the system is too disordered? It's now, you know, become too disordered, and there's no sort of memory in the system. There's no integration in the system. Is an intriguing possibility. So how the brain activity relates to criticality and how that separates from entropy is a intriguing question for the future. So we did measure directly with a VAS item, a bit simplistic. I wouldn't want to get too carried away with the inferences on the result, but it fits the hypothesis. It's just a correlation, but quite strong, small sample, with signal diversity measured with Lempel-Ziff complexity, relating significantly to reports of richness of experience. First time we've done that, actually, you know, go in and ask directly about richness of experience. And so, yes, it fitted, but it's just one correlation. Now, I'm going to think about time, because I'm mindful that a good chunk of time for questions would be good. I've taken longer than I hoped to, because I thought with so much time, that's a license to go deep on a few things. So let's see if I can speed up a little bit and cover everything before the end. I'm seeing 22 on here. I think people would probably like about 20 minutes for questions. Is that right? Yeah? I'll do my best to say 5 minutes more, and then we'll go into questions. Is that going to work? Yeah. So I think one failing of my research in the research field so far is to address a question of, which is sort of referred to in Rebus and the anarchic brain. You know, why are these compounds psyche revealing? Most of the work has talked and really emphasized the instability, the breakdown, the kind of negative, if you want, systems breaking down, the high-level systems disintegrating. But what about the content? What about the insight? You know, where's that coming from? And I just don't think we've done a good enough job. And so I had a few kind of poetic, philosophical things to say on that point. I recently was introduced to this differentiation between agency and a device. I think it originates from Daniel Dennett, referred to in this interesting paper. And so, again, this is sort of on the theme of disintegration, brain, mind, body surrendering agency, taking a position of device under psychedelic. These are states of surrender, surrendering to a flow. And a fascinating question for me, is there any intrinsic sort of order to the phenomena under drug? You know, is it psychedelics all, you know, 100% all about the combination drug times therapy, or is there actually something that is allowed to flow in a sense under psychedelic, that at least with the right supportive sort of nurturing container flows intrinsically in a healthy direction? I think that's a fascinating question, and there's no time really to, maybe that's my excuse, to carry on that theme. But I would say that we're starting to test it now, and in fact we did already with a single item in our depression trial, asking about a sense of an intrinsic healing process. Yes, we saw a correlation between ratings on that and therapeutic outcomes, but more needs to be done with that whole phenomenon. It's also a sensitive one, it'd be easy to sort of misunderstand. Anyway, just know that in a current anorexia trial, psilocybin therapy for anorexia, which is going very well so far, we are asking about this intrinsic or perceived intrinsic healing process in a direct way in that study. So if we look in the brain after psychedelic therapy, as we're starting to do in a couple of studies, and other teams are as well, in our data across our 2 depression trials, we've seen something consistent that also consistently correlates with improvements in symptom severity. And it's a decrease in brain modularity, which is consistent with an increase in global brain integrity, and it's intriguing. So time will tell whether it replicates. It's implicating high-level systems in particular. Time will tell whether it replicates. 2 hits, I think a third, and we really get excited. We have seen trending decreases in modularity in healthy brains 1 month post 25 milligrams of psilocybin that correlate with improvements in well-being. Is that a third replication? Maybe time will tell when we publish. But it is a view of how the brain changes after psychedelic therapy that speaks to a potential model, one of an energy landscape or a state space that is too modular in pathology. You could think of a literal depression in a state space that you get stuck into, an attractor state, hard to get out of, easy to fall back into, and how that flattens under drug. I think we've seen that compellingly with the acute brain imaging data, that flattening of the energy landscape. But now for the first time we've seen it after drug. And that is what was quite exciting, I think, about this recent paper published in Nature Medicine. Now, time. I'm into the 20 minutes. Not enough time to talk about rebus, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. I can say we've measured it with traveling waves and seen it support the hypothesis, so less top-down traveling waves, more bottom-up under DMT, mapping the kinetics and the dynamics of the drug experience. Intuitively, I think the model makes a lot of sense if we think of loss of confidence in what's what generally, loss of confidence in the self, the ego dissolution, and how then content can emerge in that context of disinhibition. But we don't know what that is yet. We do measure it more directly recently. Again, this is that healthy volunteer study where we ask people about certain beliefs, and we ask this ahead of the study, and then they're reminded of the belief under drug. And what we found is that negative self-beliefs are, the confidence in those beliefs drops under drug and after drug as well. So whether that's sort of in a sense, correction of an anomalous view of self is an interesting question that could potentially speak to these potentially intrinsically, somewhat intrinsically therapeutic mechanisms, relaxing pathologically overweighted beliefs about self. We do this in the anorexia trial. Meg, who's leading that trial, might kick me for sort of breaking exclusivity. But we're seeing very interesting things in beliefs about self, beliefs about body, beliefs about anorexia and how it serves you under psilocybin and after psilocybin in that trial. So, all right, there was also a correlation between levels of complexity under drug recorded with EEG and this effect of relaxing beliefs. So it very much fits the model. Well, this is a consciousness event, and the remainder of my slides are about psychedelic therapy. Perhaps you might ask me some questions about it. This forest plot looking at differences between conditions. It missed on the primary. It hit on a lot of secondaries, but it missed on the primary. Psilocybin versus escitalopram. If those bars all cross the center line, they would favor psilocybin with greater than 95% confidence, but it missed on the primary. Faster onset of therapeutic effects with psilocybin versus escitalopram. And if we split by those coming off conventional meds and those who didn't, then it massively makes a difference. Those coming in fresh, not on any meds, significant even on the quids on the primary. But if you look at the third of the sample who came off SSRIs to come in the trial, It improved their response to escitalopram, because they go back on an SSRI. And it significantly attenuated response to psilocybin as well, so it compressed any difference. It's a confounder. It was a confounder in this trial. What would you do in the future? You could do a few things. Only fresh, unmedicated brains coming in. Sorry to be so brain-centric there. Or you keep people on their meds. That's another way to do it. And does this work despite being on your conventional med? That's another way to address the question. Thank you for your attention. Oh, I had another slide about reflections, but maybe they'll come up in the questions. Thank you to Abby and Stuart and George for having me here in person. So delighted to be able to have attended. Had a wonderful time here. Thank you again for your attention, and hopefully we can get some questions in. Sure.
Thank you very much for that stunning overview of all your incredible work. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, and we don't have a lot of time. I would ask people to be very focused, keep it to single questions, and as I like to say during these sessions, let's focus on the psychedelic experience, not your psychedelic experience. Sir, please.
Thank you. That was quite the trip, if I might say so. My question is actually about temporality. Have you noticed, or are there any papers right now published or in your research finding correlates between time perception and brain activity? You know, I think there's a lot of self-reported phenomenology around people experiencing a slowdown in time or a speed up in time in psychedelics. Are there, and you mentioned previously in your speech just now that there were a change in state in state shifts in terms of brain activity. So I'm just curious, has there been a mapping between brain activity in terms of rapidity in state changes neurologically, and does that relate to self-reported temporal changes or temporal shifts in patients?
Yes, good question. Now, who's looked at it? People have looked at temporal perception even with behavioral paradigms, and I think that particular one showed a relative slowing of time, estimated time windows, as in you overestimate the time. You think it was longer than it actually was. Other times that I think we've measured it, there's just a general disturbance in time perception. It's like time loses its meaning under drug. How it relates to the brain, I'm not sure. What I might do, if it's all right, is just go to one slide, thanks George, where I didn't sort of linger on it, and I sort of wish I did. It's here, because one of these examples, the one says time processing, used, I think it was sort of audio scripts, and then looked at the processing of different windows of time referred to in the semantics of the scripts. I think that's how they did it, and found that the high-level cortex was processing longer temporal windows. Now, I showed this slide because there's an apparent overlap between all these different properties of human brain organization, from 2A distribution, cortical expansion, expansion through a lifetime, principal gradient of functional connectivity, longer fibers in this pattern, more variable functional connectivity, lighter myelination, more abstract semantic information, longer temporal windows, traveling waves mapping to this pattern, and action of psychedelics. So anyway, in a sense, system for processing long temporal windows, which arguably is something that humans are especially adept at doing, is, put very simply, hit by psychedelics. Yeah, I wish I could say something a bit more informed, and I wonder if I'm missing some sophisticated behavioral paradigm that's looked at temporal processing in a more finessed way than I've referred to. Apologies if so. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. Great talk. My question's about the difference between the phenomenology of two very similar molecules, which you hinted at, the NMDMT and 5-MeO-NN-DMT. So just for the audience, because not everyone may know this, I'm sure a lot do, but in the 5-MeO experience, apparently, there is often a sense of infinite, of the infinite, a sense of almost sometimes featureless landscapes that go on forever, and a sense of fusion with that infinite, sometimes fusion with God, a kind of Brahman-like kind of experience. Whereas DMT has got very much more in terms of individual phenomenological content, you know, the so-called machine elves, lots of geometric visual hallucinations, much more visual, much more phenomenological content, apparently. So the question is why, and you were sort of hinting at it, so I was just going to give an alternative and see what you think. So ultimately, one of the things your studies have shown is that there's a huge increase in integration, particularly with the visual cortex and other areas of the brain. So could it be that with 5-MeO, there's so much integration that basically everything is integrated with everything else. So you lose your differentiation because you need to have modules within the brain, as it were, to perceive individual items. So perhaps there's just this total integration and association. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that fits in a sense. It sort of fits this energy landscape model where the landscape would be entirely flat. So there would be no differentiation. There would be oneness. Everything would be the same. There's no differences. And so it fits in that sense. I suppose if someone was to challenge, they might say, you know, it would be a challenge on the specifics of integration. You know, or is that pure disintegration, you know, when you have a flat landscape? But that comes down to semantics and what we mean by integration. Yeah.
Next question, sir.
Robert Kagbo from Usona Institute. Got a couple of questions. I'm going to stick with just single one. You did talk about the serotonin receptor 2A, which is really important. You went into depth about it. One could imagine that any biochemical processes or pathways that upregulate or deregulate that would be important to study. Have you looked at genes that really regulate the serotonin uptake, the serotonin receptors? I know in psychosis and bipolar disorders, there's this SL62A gene that is really important. So have you looked at any genetic markers?
Oh, you're stretching my expertise, Patrick. I do know that there's that Ballantine paper that looked at mRNA expression and made mappings between the phenomenology, I think from, was it Erowid reports or first-person reports of drug? Where do I cite it? I'm not sure. I do cite it somewhere. Published in Science Advances, and then mappings between gene expression with mRNA from autoradiography, and then mapping to different drugs, psychoactive drugs, broadly defined psychedelic drugs. But specifics of the 2A genes, I wish I knew more than I do, I'm afraid. Can't say anything especially informed on that, I'm sorry. Yeesh.
Next question. We only have about 6 minutes left, so please keep it very focused. Thank you.
I was very intrigued with the slide comparing the crosstalk on psychedelic drugs versus placebo and trying to conceptualize it. And it would seem that the brain would have evolved to sort of optimize the level and maybe even minimize the level of crosstalk to that which would be necessary. And perhaps pathology is representing what amounts to suboptimal crosstalk, and that what the psychedelics could do is to raise it into the optimal range.
Yes.
With the qualification that if you raise it too far, you could end up with a bad trip.
Yes. Yeah. Bad trip or a wonderfully blissful trip. Is that the flat landscape that you might achieve under 5-MeO that people say is oneness with God or everything? And so I'm not sure if it does valence necessarily. I'm not sure. Maybe it could go to, it pushes, sort of fans out in terms of variance. It could be the most hellish experience of your life, or it could go to the most blissful. But yes to the, I can't quite remember how you worded it, but it's essentially the same theme of, drops in differentiation. The crosstalk, this is a schematic when I show this landscape thing, but it's the same essential thing as, the brains and the colors going across the brain. It's, I suppose, really nicely shown by this particular metric. And yeah, I think it's an overshoot, the dominant model, or a dominant model, hierarchical predictive processing in cognitive neuroscience, and now increasingly psychiatry, biological psychiatry. Yes, to a point, but does it overshoot, And actually my reflection slide wanted to highlight nuances, subtleties in psychedelic therapy, and overshooting being one of them. Like you can overshoot with so many things. You can overshoot with the medical model. You can overshoot with a biological model. You can overshoot with spirituality, that's spiritual bypassing. It's so easy to overshoot with these things. And in terms of brain organization, you could overshoot with specialism. You could be, a specialism in your domain, like a psychedelic scientist, and forget about your kids. And, you could overshoot about everything close to home. But, all these things need to be held lightly. And I actually think that could be health, that kind of pluralism, adaptability. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you for your talk. I just am so intrigued that we're living in a secular society. Drug abuse is a major problem, the easy escapism of drugs. And yet, in a secular society, here we're entering also a return to religious language. The God, the everything, the omnipotence. Now, is this a deliberate, or shall we say, a discovery of, hey, this is the way to find God? I mean, you're using this language, insightfulness. It's all language that's putting the psychedelics in a very positive way. So do we find this ultimate by simply taking these psychedelics instead of the previous way of just faith or working hard or going through life and belief systems? All that unnecessary, just go to psychedelics.
Well, great question, because it speaks to a wonderful tension. And I think certainly not, that would be overshooting to say only go to psychedelics, but they are remarkably robust and reliable ways of giving you the experience that is at the heart of religion. And I think it is a fantastic scientific opportunity to look at that phenomenon and try and better understand it. What an opportunity for science.
What did you say?
What an opportunity for science to understand, in a sense, the essence of religion.
And maybe to combine in some way.
Maybe.
Just on that note, I just want to refer you to a book that was published, I believe, in 1968 called The Private Sea, which explored the themes of psychedelia and religion that was emerging at that time.
Is that two words, the private?
C, S-E-A. Next question, sir.
Thanks for your talk. Have you put any thought into extending the psychedelic therapy paradigm to supporting spontaneous pivotal states?
Just repeat the question, sorry?
So have you put any thought into extending the psychedelic therapy paradigm into supporting naturally occurring pivotal mental states?
Great question. I mean, R.D. Laing did, in a sense, I guess you see the instability of a psychopathology like an incipient psychosis as an opportunity, a transformation in process. And if this transformation in process is happening probably because of the causal events that led up to that psychotic process are horribly bad, then could this person be brought into a wonderfully nurturing context to try and make this transformation not necessarily crystallize into a chronic, schizophrenia, for example. We all know about the history of that kind of challenging perspective. But when, doctor charges in with a depot of 2A blocking drug or whatever it is, and maybe restraints to deal with a psychotic episode, it's not a great setting, that's not a great context. I know this is very hot, sensitive, anti-psychiatry type stuff, but maybe, is there enough thought that goes into context, that goes into setting in mental health care? Probably not. So, yeah, I've thought about it.
Although we are officially out of time, I'm going to relax my beliefs as a moderator. And we'll take these next 3 questions. Please keep them focused. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Robin. Great talk. So in your talk, you talked a lot about the positive long-term effects of taking these drugs. But as you just mentioned, and we've kind of touched on, some individuals experience negative long-term effects, such as psychosis. And so I'm wondering if you can speak on a little bit more of the mechanisms underlying how these drugs can have such adverse effects in that population of people. Is it more than genetic predispositions?
Sure. Great question. The first thing I'd say is I didn't speak about the long-term benefits that people experience from taking these drugs. Mm-hmm. I definitely didn't say that. I said that psychedelic therapy is best thought of as a combination treatment that takes a period of instability that could easily pivot towards psychopathology and tries to provide a therapeutic container such that that pivot can go towards health rather than pathology. I had to mention that qualification because I think it's very easy for people to hear a talk like this and see great results and think it's all about the drugs. It's not about the drugs. The drugs are risky, Mm-hmm. So it's about how you contain that experience. So to the adverse events, I think, is it a genetic cause? I don't think the evidence is that compelling for that at the moment. Seem to be slightly anchored right now. Or is it context, an issue with the context? My hypothesis would be that it's an issue with the context, and that could go wrong at multiple stages. Could it be something about the trait presentation before as well that is like a contraindication? We have data to speak to that as well. We've got some naturalistic data that suggests that a history of a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder predicts what we call a bottom margin response, which is an anomalously negative response with greater than 4-fold likelihood of going into that bottom margin if you have a history of personality disorder. So what the causes are of that trait, susceptibility is a key issue. So it's complicated. It's probably contextual problems combined with some trait sensitivity, I think. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you. Last 2 questions. Please keep them focused.
Hi, Robin. I'm curious if you've ever thought about or if you see any value in connecting and integrating your theorizing at the neurological level with theory at the psychological level.
Oh, I really hoped I was doing that. Yeah. To be honest, way back when I would have loads of phenomenology in my talks, loads of first-person accounts. I have less of that now because I think the meat of things is in the mechanisms, and you can get lost in solipsistic thinking. I had a slide on these changes in metaphysical beliefs that we've seen in some of our data. I think what's happening there is people are having these wild experiences and believing that the source is out there rather than being in here. If they thought it was insight about the nature of the psyche, then it would be different to them thinking somehow, I don't know, there's something out there like DMT entities are somewhere or another dimension that we can access. I think that's an inferential, my own view is that that's an inferential error on the source, the origin of the interpretation of the signal.
And our last question, please.
So I'm personally always curious about how different drugs that apparently target the same receptors can actually have so many different effects, like behavioral effects and like cognitive effects, and trigger so many different experiences. So I don't know if you have a lot of time, but I was wondering if you can expand a little bit more on that.
On what, sorry?
So I'm wondering how different drugs that target like the same receptor can have like so many different behavioral effects.
Yeah, absolutely. What I've done is given you a horribly canalized talk about the 2A receptor and classic psychedelics. Of course, there are other fascinating psychoactive compounds that are psychedelic-like, ketamine, ibogaine, salvia, you name it. There's a lot of fascinating compounds out there with different pharmacologies. Studying those drugs could reveal other secrets about the brain. Some might overlap with classic psychedelics. I suppose that track hasn't been my speciality, and maybe it's one of my many failings. So yes, there's obviously a lot more to this than just 2A and classic psychedelics, but that is my main area of expertise.
Thank you very much. Can we have another round of applause for Dr. Carhart-Harris? And thank you for being such a wonderful and respectful audience. Before you head out into the clear light of the Bardo, I just want to say that we're going to have another session on psychedelic drugs starting a little after 2, where we're going to hear from Dr. Kwan and Dr. and Katrine about some of the canonical psychedelics, and then we'll also hear a little bit about some of the non-canonical psychedelics. So we hope to see you then. Again, thank you so much, Robin.